Hi, Sarah. This is great. I can see everyone coming on. I promise that no EDA student who hasn't joined is going to fail. Actually, that's going to get everyone leaving now, isn't it? Yes, indeed, Abdurrahman, we are ready to connect the dots, I hope. So hello, everyone. Good evening, and thank you for joining me. Thank you, first of all, to the Emirates Diplomatic Academy for hosting this, for providing the platform, and for inviting many of you along. My name is Tom Fletcher. I'm a recovering ambassador, currently sitting out the coronavirus on an island just off Abu Dhabi. And tonight what I want to do is share some ideas, some questions about where this virus will leave us in terms of diplomacy, in terms of statecraft, and in terms of geopolitics, and maybe in terms of society as well. And the idea is really to throw out some questions and to try and get a conversation going with you all. So welcome to the students of EDA who were the initial invitees. Welcome to students of New York University in Shanghai and in New York, here in Abu Dhabi and across the global campus of NYU Abu Dhabi. And welcome friends and colleagues from around the world and others who are just interested in diplomacy or just fancied coming and kind of hanging out on here for a while this evening. Just before getting going, obviously, huge solidarity to everyone stuck at home or safe at home, as our school was telling us just earlier on, not stuck at home. As we go through this pandemic, huge solidarity, obviously, to everyone who is particularly anxious about loved ones, friends, and family. Today we're talking about what happens on the other side of the pandemic, but I'm conscious that for many of us, this is, we're in the midst of it at the moment. And of course, huge solidarity to those who are actually out there on the front lines of the effort to take on the challenge of this pandemic. And of course, that includes many diplomats. And I'm very conscious sitting here as an armchair diplomat. This doesn't actually have arms, but you know what I mean. That the real work of diplomacy is going on as we speak. So fair play to those people who are out there doing that work, and all power to your elbow. So what I'm going to do, I'm very conscious that at the moment there are a lot of hot takes out there about what's happening to geopolitics as a result of this pandemic, and I have to be honest and say that of almost all the hot takes that I've seen so far, almost all of them have confirmed people's existing views. So if your view was already that this was the Chinese century, then probably you're now going to say the virus just shows, the response in China to the virus shows that this is the Chinese century. If you'd already decided that the liberal international system was finished, then this just confirms that existing view, and so on. So I'm going to try really hard to not just repeat all of my existing prejudices and my existing worldview and just bolt on COVID-19 to justify that view. I'm also going to try very, very hard not to make predictions, mainly because almost all the predictions I've made in the last 10 years haven't actually come to reality. So I'm now much more careful about predictions. But also because, as I say, we just don't know where this will leave us. Everything is speculation at the moment, particularly at this point of the crisis when we are very much in the eye of the hurricane. And to be honest, I think it's worth telling ourselves that that's okay. We don't have to have the answers now when we're at this stage of dealing with this crisis. So what I'm going to give you instead are my 10 questions, which I think that diplomats, those who care about diplomacy, those who follow statecraft closely, those who think about international relations, but also society at large, will really need to struggle with as we emerge from this crisis. So thank you for the waves, by the way, very much appreciated. It feels very strange being here in an empty room, but it's lovely knowing that you're there, and some smiley faces, some also bemused faces. I hope that is, well, let's not speculate too much as to what that's about. So, my 10 questions on how we emerge from this, the 2020 pandemic. The first one seems quite parochial. It's basically, what are we going to learn about the tradecraft of diplomacy as a result of this? I think that diplomatic craft will change more as a result of this phase, this crisis, than as a result of anything since the invention of the internet. And as you know, I think the internet has done more to change diplomacy than any invention since the printing press. And we know that every time a big shock like this comes along, we always, a bit like as with technology, as Bill Gates says, we always overestimate the short-term implications and underestimate the long-term implications. So the first thing we have to think about is, how is this changing the craft of diplomacy? And of course, diplomats who are out there know that diplomacy is a craft that depends on meeting people, establishing close human contact, shaking hands. Every peace process ends with a handshake. And so how are we going to find a way to create that human connection? Edward Murrow calls it, the last 3 feet of diplomacy. How do you create that connection online? We're all experimenting. This is an experiment. We've all been on Zoom, finding different ways to try and create that human contact. So essential to diplomacy, and yet missing at the moment. I think there are 3 other big silver linings in terms of diplomatic craft. The first one is that diplomats collectively will leave a much lighter carbon footprint than they were before this crisis. And that can only be a good thing. We'll probably look back and realise that we were flying around way too much. I remember, Hillary Clinton, when she was Secretary of State, very proud of the number of hours she'd spent on planes. I don't think we'll be boasting about the amount we fly in the future, and that's a good thing. Second great silver lining in terms of tradecraft, I think, is that there will be more respect, more recognition, and also more resource available for crisis and consular work. Now, often I think, and certainly in my diplomatic lifetime, 25 years or so, there's been a great step forward in the way that we value crisis and consular work. But it's not enough. And it's still often seen as almost the poor relation of political work and commercial work and economic work. And so I really hope that is now seen as far more important, because that is ultimately what the public out there is judging us on. Someone's just said Dr. Murray is very happy with this point. So I'm pleased to hear that, Dr. Murray. The third, I think, really important aspect, actually I think Dr. Murray was probably pleased with the carbon footprint point. Third really important thing I think we'll learn about the tradecraft of diplomacy, and again it's an overdue lesson, is that the answer to every diplomatic and political challenge in the world is not an international conference. We don't have to have an international summit every time we want to demonstrate that we care about something. Hi George from Lebanon as well, and Sarah, thank you. Yes, we will be boasting about Zoom diplomacy. I think no one's come up yet with the clever way of describing Zoom diplomacy. So that's the first challenge. What have we learned about the way our tradecraft has to adapt to a period when human connection is much, much harder to establish? Right, question number 2. And if you have answers to these questions, far away. Question number 2, how can we ensure that this virus, this pandemic, is as big a boost for the international rules-based system, for the global architecture, as World War II was for the global architecture? The late 40s, after the Second World War, were really the golden period for the establishment of the international system that we rely on so much today. The UN, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the IMF, the World Bank, getting up and running. For the first time, a proper global system of governance. And that has been looking incredibly shaky, particularly since Donald Trump's election, but, predating that as well. The last decade has not been a great one for global cooperation. So how do we use this crisis to actually reboot that global architecture? Because I think that one thing the crisis has demonstrated is that there is such a thing as global society, but that people don't really feel that our current institutions reflect that. That they don't feel represented in those institutions. The UN Security Council hasn't got up and running on the coronavirus as yet because it's being blocked by America and by China. So we've got to find a way to reboot that architecture. I think there are some big opportunities coming up to do that. One is COP26. It's been postponed. They won't meet physically in Glasgow in November. But on this huge challenge of climate change, the world has got to come together in some way in November. And with a bold vision, not just the usual platitudes. So that's a big test for our international system. Two more, I think there's a great opportunity in September. New York, the 75th anniversary of the UN, a key moment for renewal. And again, for people to set out a bold vision of what the UN can be in the 21st century. This isn't happening at the moment. And even if they can't meet in reality, physically, we have to use that moment to give the UN a boost. And then the third, I think, really important moment in the autumn is going to be the G20. The G20 was kind of recreated at leader level by Gordon Brown as British Prime Minister 10 years ago. I was working for him at the time, and so I had a ringside seat as he was doing that. And now it's really got to come into its own again. You can't fix this crisis at the G7. You can't fix it actually at the UN, which is too big and too cumbersome to tackle some of the economic implications. The G20 is that ideal-sized body for responding to this crisis. So a huge moment in November in Riyadh and in the run-up to Riyadh. Sarah's asking, will the G20 put this on the agenda? I mean, I think the G20 will have to set out a really clear action plan to reboost the global economy. We'll be in that phase at that point, looking at the catastrophic economic implications of the pandemic. And I was supporting last week Gordon Brown, Helen Clark, former Prime Minister Zapatero, former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, all these former leaders as they set out their vision for a plan, a global action plan. So that's the second one. Can we reboost the international architecture in the way that the Second World War forced us to build that international architecture in the first place? Right, number three. Let's see. How do we show, as diplomats, but I think to be honest, as humans as well, that connectivity, human connection, is still more important to the world than national distancing. Now, when you look around at the moment, I think you can see a lot of leaders, world leaders, who've really responded. They've risen to this challenge, risen to this crisis. The leaders who show empathy, who show human solidarity, who base their response on reason and not on what they think will get ratings for their press conference. There are lots of those out there. I think Jacinda Ardern is one of those who once again has risen to that challenge. Emmanuel Macron has been great, I think. Several leaders like that. But there have also clearly been leaders who haven't risen to that challenge. Some because they've completely denied that the virus exists, and some because they've insisted on bolting on their existing prejudices, calling this the Chinese virus is clearly not a way to establish a global response. The danger is, I fear, that as we emerge from the crisis period, many of those, the wall builders basically, will be using this crisis to justify further national isolation, further national distancing, to use one of those crisis words. The people who think that the answer to the 21st century is just to build a bigger a bigger wall. And that ironically will mean that a pandemic that shows you need global cooperation could actually risk undermining that global cooperation. Countries will become more autarkic. They'll feel they need to be more self-sufficient. They'll worry much more about their supply chains, and they'll divert resources away from international issues to national issues. I hope you're right that the economy will boost itself as we come out. I'm sure that is the case, but I think it will need that extra collective boost, that sense of vision as we come out of the crisis. Because every challenge, as we know, from climate change to conflict to automation to dealing with the next pandemic, and there will be many more, I'm afraid, in the future, to genuine equality of opportunity, all those challenges require us to work together much more closely together at the global level as human beings. You can't self-isolate a country. The pandemic has shown us that once again. And to be honest, and I think this is a challenge to people like me who've been quite evangelical about social media and connectivity, I think in the early days of the crisis, social media hasn't actually helped that much. It distracted us when we needed to understand the virus better, and then it made us very anxious, actually, in the period when actually we just needed to calm down and kind of collectively get through it. But I think as the situation has developed, as the crisis has developed, it has brought out of us a deeper form of connectivity. You know, when we see those videos of the Italians on the balconies singing, I mean, last night, fantastic Andrea Bocelli concert. So many of these moments that we're sharing repeatedly every day demonstrate that the value of that human connectivity. They remind us why we need each other. They remind us that we're alone, but we're alone together. The challenge for statecraft, for diplomacy, is trying to ensure we marshal that sense of connectivity to take on these huge global challenges ahead of us. Khamis is asking, what is the biggest lesson I've learned from COVID-19? Well, I think it's that. I think it's that we do need much, much better systems for global cooperation and global leadership, that those have really failed us so far in dealing with the crisis. I think another one, Khamis, which I'll come on to actually, is that we've learned again that expertise and reason do matter. And I think that's a very important takeaway. Right, question 4. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on this one as well. How do we ensure that diplomacy and statecraft finds ways to include more of those people who've been both empowered and disempowered by this crisis, by this pandemic? So what do I mean by that? I mean, we're going to need the tech leaders to be much more involved in creating the jobs and growth that will bring us out of the economic crisis that we're going to experience in the months and years ahead. We're going to need to make sure that the voices of the vulnerable are heard much more clearly in the debate about what we do next. And I think as well, we'll have to ensure that our institutions are more reflective of genuinely global voices. I think this will be a moment when countries, particularly, I think, east of Abu Dhabi, who will feel that they've actually responded pretty effectively to this crisis, are more likely to demand a bigger seat at the table, more influence at the table. And I think that we'll have to recognise that, and I think in the West we'll have to recognise that with some humility. Awanik is just coming in saying, it's good to hear, but let's be realistic, the world's in deep debt, more than 250 trillion USD. A pessimistic view there, I get that. But we don't bounce back out of that with purely national solutions. It's going to have to be an international plan that gets us through it. And we've bounced back. You know, I was there 2008, 2009, and it was very, very bleak. Maybe not as bleak as this. But visionary leaders did see that if you got that cooperation in place, then you could reboot the global economy. Nora, hi Nora, is watching Easter around the world. I'm thinking of Ramadan coming. Do you believe from what we've seen that commitment and containment will continue from the community in UAE? I don't know, to be honest, Nora. You're probably a better judge of that than me. I think you probably have a population here which is small enough to make it easier to contain. I think you have, clearly you have let's say, a more robust security architecture than many countries in the world, and I think that will be part of that. I think too, in my experience, people have really got the message about social distancing. But Ramadan will be tough, won't it? Because by that stage the country will be in week 7, week 8, week 9 of the lockdown, and some people will really be needing that sense of community. I hope that what happens, you mentioned Easter, as far as I could tell in the UK and elsewhere, people found ways to use Easter to gather together, but just using the technology in different ways. I was very struck that my parents seem to be socialising way more on Easter Day than they do under normal circumstances on a normal Easter Day. I'm going to do one more question, then go back to mine. Majid Maktoum, on the note of the vulnerable, would you say that a feminist foreign policy would be a useful tool for this pandemic? Well, I'm very proud to be involved with the Diplo Women project that Karma is leading in Lebanon, bringing together a lot of the most brilliant, outstanding women diplomats around the world. I think that you can't fail to notice that the leaders who have responded with the greatest empathy and have really found the words, I think, to connect with people and reassure people have often been women leaders. Several women leaders have been incredibly effective in this crisis so far. So, absolutely right. We have to ensure that diplomacy, as my students have heard me say many times, is way more effective when women are much more involved. It's the evidence is very clear. Diplo women, you're right. Fist for Diplo women. Number 5, then, this is actually a broader question that predates the crisis, but how do we ensure that as diplomats and as leaders and politicians out there, that we don't sacrifice the important always when we're dealing with the urgent? Now, this is very, very hard with a pandemic like that. We are running around trying to deal with an enormous crisis here, but there's a real risk that we just push aside many of the really important issues that still need to be dealt with. I've mentioned climate change a number of times. Dwight Eisenhower says, what is important is seldom urgent, and what is urgent is seldom important. We've got to make sure that the important remains at the forefront of the diplomatic response, and that's got to include all the peacemaking efforts which are probably being put on a back burner at the moment. Afghanistan, Libya, Israel, Palestine, Yemen, an opportunity to really rebuild a decent peace process in Yemen. There's a danger all that gets set back because diplomats are inevitably having to charge around and deal with the immediate crisis response. And there's a danger then that there's less energy in the system to deal with other viruses, extremism, polarization, radicalization, injustice, or to protect the refugees and civilians who are still under attack, not least in Syria as we speak. And there's a danger, I think, at the end of this crisis that we'll find we have more failed states. And that's before the economic implications really kick in. And there'll be real setbacks because we've been working on other things, setbacks to cross-border cooperation on narcotics, on extremism, on terrorism. Plenty of bad guys out there will not let this crisis go to waste. Right, George, how do you foresee the future of the EU after COVID-19? That was really it's very much the question I was most hoping you wouldn't ask. So thank you very much for that, George. Look, clearly the negotiations on Brexit have been slowed down by the crisis. The jury is still out as to whether there's going to be time to get that negotiation done. I think there's still a lot of desire on the part of the UK government to crack on and do that. But meanwhile, the EU is dealing with a long list of its own problems, and I think we are seeing, some cracks open up over the response to this crisis. So it's not going to be easy. But probably in the medium term, regionalism is going to be strengthened as a result of this. Internationalism is taking a hit, but I think many people will see the need to cooperate more across their immediate regional borders. As I say, you can't self-isolate a country. Look at North Korea. Do I think the UN Security Council needs reform? Yes, certainly. We have seen once again the way in which countries, in this case America and China, I'm sorry to say, are able to prevent the Security Council putting an issue which everyone can see is urgent and vital on the agenda, and that shouldn't be the case. Now look, I'm a Brit, obviously, and so I'm not going to be in the vanguard of those saying that we should completely change everything about the UN Security Council. I think the British role is very, very important, but I think there will be increased pressure for reform of the way the Security Council works. It's not given sufficient backing through this crisis to the WHO and other bits of the UN system. UNHCR, which is out there dealing with the brutal consequences of this crisis. Obaid, what do you believe countries could have done differently from day one, which may have led to less of a disaster than what we're witnessing today? I think they could have listened to the experts much earlier. They could have taken the crisis in Asia and China and Wuhan much more seriously than they did. I think people just ignored it early on, so didn't move fast enough to put in place the measures that we need. And I think there wasn't enough of an effort, and we're all at fault for this, but in the last 10, 20 years, to build the right structure at national level and international level to prepare for pandemics. The White House sacked their pandemics guy, but collectively we weren't in good enough shape to respond to this, despite the fact that there's real experts out there who've dealt with Ebola, who've dealt with SARS, who knew what to do, but their views weren't sufficiently listened to early on. Right, let me do a couple more of my questions and then come back to some of these, which are much better questions coming through here. Right, my sixth question, and this is quite a big one, and we won't all agree on it, I don't think, on this call, but more widely, is what does this actually mean for freedom? Now, clearly there's a big debate ahead of us on freedom of movement, freedom to trade. This crisis is going to have huge implications for those. But actually, I'm talking much more about freedom of the individual, because a common feature of how everyone, liberal democracies to autocracies, has had to deal with this crisis is that they've had to do it by restricting our freedom as individuals. That's quite challenging to someone like me from the generation that sees the world through the prism of 1989. That year when, before YouTube, we watched the videos go viral of the Berlin Wall falling. Before Twitter, we watched the global campaigns for the end of apartheid. 1989, that year when, before Instagram, those photos of the protesters in Tiananmen Square went viral. We were shaped very much by this sense that history was moving in that one direction, towards greater freedom, greater liberty for the individual. And this crisis will set that back, because I think many people will emerge from it saying that actually the countries that coped best had a more authoritarian model, a less transparent model. And I think many of the surveillance systems that will now have to be put in place on things like contact tracing will be quite difficult to roll back after the crisis. Governments, and not just autocratic governments, will be quite reluctant to give up these new powers that they'll be taking on in the next weeks and months. And so we've got, I believe that those of us who think that the sort of arc of history bends towards greater liberty of the individual, we have an argument, a fight on our hands in the future. One important related argument, related question, is actually around the new social contract, the new social covenant. When governments have gone to huge expense to protect jobs and workers, enormous amounts of money, as several of you have been saying on that. What are the responsibilities we have in return, and what rights can we continue to demand as part of that new social covenant? we already needed a new social contract for the digital age, and I'm very glad that a great friend of mine, Alec Ross, is thinking hard about these issues and hopefully writing about these issues soon. But we're going to need to revisit that in the light of what we've learned from this crisis. Right, here's another one. Here's my seventh one. Is trust back? Have we got trust back? There's been this trend in the last 5-10 years, real decline in levels of trust, and we saw that. It was trust in the media, and media scandals in the UK and elsewhere. It was trust in the banks with the banking crisis 10 years ago, trust in governments, but also trust was falling very fast in doctors and teachers and so on. Trust in anything that looked like authority, and then suddenly we're in the midst of this crisis. And we're listening to the experts again. We're applauding our health workers. We're prioritising the views of people who actually know what they're talking about. I know we're hearing a lot of other stuff as well on how to deal with the virus, but ultimately we listen to the experts again, which is fabulous. And teachers. I've been homeschooling now for 4 or 5 weeks, and I put this graph on Twitter that basically my respect for teachers against the days of the crisis kind of goes up exponentially, and that can only be a good thing. That some trust comes back in experts. Think how we will react to the scientist or the group of scientists probably who find the vaccine. We'll remember them way after we've forgotten every other leader who's dealing with the crisis at the moment. So expertise is back, I hope, in fashion, and that can only be a good thing. What I hope that diplomats and governments and leaders and politicians can do is find a way to really show that they've earned that trust back, and that they can do substantive things with it, and that they don't kind of lose that trust again too quickly. Sarah, I'm going to see a big shift in how we relate to health systems, more investments in healthcare systems. I hope so. In fact, I was going to come on to that. My next one, I really hope that countries, particularly those who've been cutting back on healthcare, that becomes much, much harder in the future. Two of the great things in the UK, in my home country, are that it will be much harder for people to criticise the BBC and much harder for people to criticise the NHS than it had become in the last year or two, when it had got quite toxic. Nora Alabar, universal income system scheme in Spain, spoken about heavily today, plunging share prices, EU concerned about, such as airlines, manufacturing, Chinese takeovers. How did the airlines even begin to rebuild, particularly those that don't have the sort of state backup that some of those in this region have? Okay, number 8 for me. My 8th question or challenge for you to think about is, who's going to find the vaccine? Where is the vaccine? Against inequality of opportunity, which is actually going to kill way more people than this crisis will. The virus hasn't changed the biggest 21st century challenge, which is how do we create more winners from globalization and digital technology and better protect those who are currently being left behind. And because when the final reckoning is in, when the numbers, the tallies are all there, it will be very, very clear that this wasn't a fair virus. It didn't hit us all equally. It will have hit the poorest and most vulnerable in our societies much, much harder. They're out there now while we're having a nice chat on Instagram Live, actually, on the front lines of this crisis in many cases. And that's even before we factor in the secondary impact, the consequences of the consequences, the economic impact on those workers further down the track. There'll be deep, in some cases, irreparable damage to economic systems. And also, on top of that, they will face an acceleration of automation. If you're a company now thinking about how to rebuild after the crisis, you're going to want fewer humans involved, I'm afraid to say. And so there's a risk that many more people are pushed out of their employment. In the West, as Sarah has said, fantastic if that leads to greater investment in our health service, greater understanding of the value of health professionals, nurses and doctors and others who've just been so extraordinary. You talk to anyone who's had this virus, talk to Boris Johnson about this. You hear a very strong endorsement, very authentic personal endorsement of the work that those guys are doing. It's been extraordinary. I'm going to have one point though about this region, if I may, the Gulf region. I hope that one thing that people reflect on at the end of this crisis here is, has an underpaid underclass been allowed to develop who are not getting the support and healthcare that they need across the region? I hope that this region will be able to look back and say that they did as much for those people as they did for their own citizens and other residents. It's a really big challenge. I think some countries will meet it, but not all. Right, I've just got two more questions or challenges for you, and then I'm going to try and do some of these questions or take more of your comments and so on. Number 9 is, how do we as diplomats, as humans, make peace between the new tribes? So what do I mean by the new tribes? In advance of this crisis, I think many of us already felt that our identities were in flux. I felt that particularly as a Brit. Am I more European or more of a Londoner? Am I more English or more global? But it takes a crisis like this to really make you think about your identity, your place in the world. And that's been hard, I think, for lots and lots of people. And I think what I found, what a lot of people have found, is that we're forming new and smaller tribes. Best indication of this, go to your WhatsApp and look at your WhatsApp groups. That's effectively your new tribes. We're breaking down those smaller groups. Extended family, your football team. We have a music group on WhatsApp where we kind of swap playlists and so on. These are our new tribes. But what happens when communities break up into smaller tribes is you get friction between the different tribes. And the role of diplomats traditionally has been to try to reduce that friction. Now, that's normally happened at the national level, where it's most obvious. But it's going to increasingly happen between all these new tribes, these new communities that we're finding our way towards. When politics is more polarized like this, people feel they have to pick a side. Donald Trump and so on has accelerated that. Now, coronavirus doesn't do that. Obviously, we're all anti-coronavirus. There isn't a kind of pro-corona team, I don't think, out there. I hope there isn't. But it does challenge us to really reflect on our identity. And the response to the virus will force us to make tough choices. Are we in the tribe that thinks we should be more open? Or are we in the tribe that thinks we should close down our societies, become smaller, become more closed off from the world? There'll be big arguments ahead between our different new tribes. And remember as well that this period ahead was already going to see massive migration, and I don't think the virus will actually change that. It may even accelerate migration. I think you'll have a lot of people moving away from places that are perceived to have bad health systems. I think as well, that this is a hypothesis and I may be very wrong, that we'll see people moving away from societies and nations that have been too draconian in the measures they impose, particularly as their societies emerge from the crisis. I still think people move towards freedom, but let's see. This is we're going to be running that test in real time in the decade ahead. So that was number 9. Then, how can we, as diplomats, you as diplomats, be the lubricant between those different tribes as that friction increases? And then final one, you'll be pleased to know, and those of you who have heard me speak a bit will not be surprised that my final one is, how do we make education upstream diplomacy? If we sort out the future of learning, then we will create what diplomats call emotional intelligence, empathy, those sorts of skills that are increasingly being prioritized in schools now, but which create a society, a better society. I've written about the need to create more citizen diplomats. The reality is that most kids in the world, most young people, are learning the wrong things in the wrong ways at the moment. And hopefully, all of us having to think so much more about education and learning will help us understand what are the real survival skills that they need in the future. And I believe they are things like creativity, kindness, courage, all those things that people call 21st century skills, but we diplomats call diplomacy. And so we'll need a stronger education of the head, hand, and heart, knowledge, skills, and character. So, I think that's it for my 10 questions. And I said I promise not to simply bolt on, the virus to my existing worldview. I suspect I've done it a bit, and you're welcome to pull me up on that. I will say one thing where my view hasn't changed, which is that despite this, and I know it is gruesome at the moment, I'm still optimistic. I think we will look back at this as a time when people properly committed to discovering new sources of energy that will save our climate in the future, to discovering new ways of caring for the most vulnerable in society. There will be amazing books and songs and works of art produced in. And I think we'll look back and see that this crisis brought out deeper forms of human solidarity, diplomacy, than we've ever known in our lifetimes. We found so many heroes in our midst, especially our health workers, but many diplomats who are real heroes at the moment. We've spent more time preparing and eating food together. We've started waving to strangers. We listen more to bird song. We call the people we love more. We're damaging nature less. We're feeling our emotions more keenly. We're maybe even discovering the silence between the notes at times. But what happens next, I think, depends on all of us as individuals. The pandemic has asked us to do nothing, in many cases, to stay home. But this next phase, as we come out of it, will require us to be there with all of our energy and idealism, I hope, and vision as we come blinking out into the post-COVID-19 world. So we hear a lot about stockpiling, sanitizing, and washing hands at the moment. I really hope that we will be stockpiling compassion for the most vulnerable in our societies, who are going to be hit worse by this virus than the rest of us. I really hope we can sanitize our politics and our discourse of the kind of polarization and extremism that there was selfishness that was infecting it in the last few years. And I really hope that we choose not to wash our hands of all these important but not so urgent crises and problems that face the world in the future. All of my predictions today, I'm very confident in saying are likely to be wrong. I think it's very foolish to make predictions at the moment. But here's one prediction that I think will be right. That after the virus, there will still be music, laughter, love, camaraderie, mountains, oceans, family, food, drink, and a sense of purpose. And we'll remember that life really is beautiful. We're here for a good time and not a long time. Now, I hope some of that was helpful. I'm going to try and do some of these questions now. Mask diplomacy, a new type of diplomacy. This is Maitha Al-Hassani. Yeah, do you reckon we're going to have mask diplomacy? Promoting soft power. We haven't talked about soft power, Maitha, today, but it's going to be really interesting to see how different countries, particularly those who are emerging, perhaps, on the other side of this conflict, of this crisis, use it to flex their soft power muscles. We've seen a bit of that from China so far. And so if you've got a moment where America is effectively saying, the White House is saying, we'll buy up all the vaccines, America first, but you have other countries reaching out. It'll be very interesting to see what that does to those soft power league tables that anyone who studied with me, we've spent some time on. Murray, the elephant in the room is China, right. Ironically, the country where the virus originated will probably emerge strongest. I think it will emerge pretty strong in the short term. But I think that the virus has also done some damage to some of China's aspirations, particularly its neighbour, the sort of the One Belt, One Road initiative and so on. I think it's a setback for that because the thing about Silk Roads is, as the great Peter Frankopan has shown us, they carry diseases as well as goods, and so I think there is some reflection there. The big challenge I think for China is it going to step up and be powerful leader within the G20 and at the UN Security Council and elsewhere in helping to build a truly global response? Or is it going to sit back and just wait for someone else to play that role? I'm not sure there are many countries, leaders, stepping forward to play that role at the moment. Yet someone's pointed out there's no vaccine yet. Very true. Luckily, if we believe in reason and science, we believe that there will be a vaccine. The sooner the better. Do I think that climate change deniers will take climate change more seriously since more trust is being given to scientists? You'd hope so. But again, I come back to my earlier point. A lot of people are going to use this crisis just to support their existing worldview. And I suspect that climate change deniers will find some sort of crazy theory that backs up, continues to back up their worldview. If I was in charge, what would be my first step to help a nation to recover from the crisis? Well, I think a lot of the countries are getting this right. You've got to give your health professionals the support they need. You've got to and listen to the medical advice and have the response driven by that medical advice. I think it's really important you take steps to protect people's jobs and income so that they're not forced to rush back into the economy too soon. And at the right moment, but it's not yet in most countries, you've then got to come out with a positive vision for where you'll take your country, where you will restore the economic growth that you need. And it can't just be a reset to what we were all doing before. We'll need to go out and find new sources of opportunity and growth. Fatima says, Fatima's in the UAE, doing the best to obey the government order, staying at home. Good to hear. I think it's the same for everyone, Fatima. I think it's hard wherever we are, but we've just got to kind of stick with it. Expo postponed, sadly, but it was the right decision. I think it's Mohammed Al-Jasmi there is saying, how do I view the private sector role and the philanthropists like Bill Gates? I'm quite a Bill Gates fan. I think what he's been doing on health systems more widely is extraordinary. But I do know, this inequality of opportunity I've spoken about, that enormous concentration of wealth in the hands of a very few people isn't the way to build a truly global society. And so I think it's amazing that Bill and others have taken the pledge to give that money away, and I hope they continue to do that. How do I think laid-off high-skilled workers should be supported this time? Well, I think many governments are doing the right thing in guaranteeing their incomes. I think in many cases we're going to have to identify what are the industries of the future that will bring us out of this crisis on the other side, and make sure that we're giving people the training to adapt their skills for those industries. What do I think? This is Hamdan. What do I think are the best outcomes of diplomacy from this pandemic? Will this urge the younger population to enter diplomacy? Well, look, I'm always going to say that we need more talented young people to come into diplomacy, to really reshape diplomacy, drag it into the 21st century. It's a craft that still needs a lot of modernisation for the 21st century. I hope so. I hope people will see that there's a diplomacy to be done, for example, between different health systems. There's a diplomacy to be done making sure that different countries have the right health equipment in place. All that is an aspect of diplomacy, needs these classic diplomatic skills around building consensus and negotiation and networking. And so even if people aren't actually diplomats, I'm hoping that they will effectively be diplomats. You don't have to be a diplomat representing your country to be doing diplomacy. Thank you. I think that's Wafa saying, good international cooperation. How important is science and engineering diplomacy during this crisis? Very, very important, but I think we also have to understand there's a danger sometimes that diplomats think that they're experts on absolutely everything. Often our role is to get the right experts in a room and give them the right kind of incentives and support in reaching agreement, but not try and suddenly be the experts on a vaccine, for example. Now I'm just going to flick through some of these. Oh, someone's trying to get me into trouble here. Do I think that this pandemic will have an impact on the current GCC dispute? I hope that that dealing with a pandemic like this demonstrates to everyone that you need greater cooperation across the region, and so I hope it's one of those times when it brings countries closer together. It's very striking. I think one of the really important things I saw done here actually early in the UAE was that the humanitarian support going out to Iran, for example. I think we need to look for more of those sort of slightly surprising moments when people see that it's a moment to reach across a divide rather than to try and build bigger walls between countries. I think Iran has learned that you can't isolate yourself completely from the region either. Do I think terrorists will use biological weapons? I think they will. I mean, I think that was a risk before the crisis, and I think it's even more of a risk now. And in a way, that's one of those issues that I'd add to that list of. It might not seem urgent, but it's really important that we're doing the preparation for those sorts of moments. Let's see. When am I coming back to Bahrain? Hello, Mazen. Well, I mean, probably not in the next few weeks. It depends when the planes are open again, when we can start moving around. I hope to come back. I'm moving back to the UK in August, September, and I would love to visit Bahrain again before that. I'd love to carry on the conversations we were having there about soft power and island diplomacy and so on. There's a huge amount to continue to discuss. Right, I'm just going through some of these questions. I'm not just dodging all the controversial ones, I hope. Although this is quite good because I can basically veto. This is great, isn't it? I can effectively veto anything that's too controversial. Good. I'm glad that people are finding this is quite a good kind of forum for discussion. I mean, the challenge for me is I still feel like it's a bit like a monologue, because what I'd love is to try and find a way to make this tech more of a discussion. I know that probably one way I should be doing that is allowing videos and so on. So maybe next time round, I will get better at kind of interacting as we're going. Yeah, I agree. You've got to rethink the international architecture, world organisations. Very important. Someone here, Secro 10, has said cybersecurity, cyber resilience. We can't abandon that. Conspiracy theories have thrived. Yeah, and again, there, social media hasn't helped. I don't know about you guys, but I've actually dropped out of a bunch of WhatsApp groups because I was just getting the same conspiracies wheeling around and around. And I've also reduced my social media engagement overall. I just got the thing this morning. I'm 24 minutes average a day now, which is much less than it used to be when I was in Lebanon, when it was more like 24 hours. Well, questions about artificial intelligence diplomacy. Let's do that as a separate conversation. One thing I will say about that, though, is I'm part of the work of something called the Global Tech Panel, and we're trying to bring tech leaders, Brad Smith and others are on it at Microsoft, and government leaders together to have a completely different conversation about how we respond to the challenges and opportunities of technology, including artificial intelligence, including lethal autonomous weapon systems, data collection. Massive challenges out there, and for me that is a very, very important front line for diplomacy. Right, I'm going to spin now down to, wow, there's a lot. This is really good. I hope we're able to preserve all of these questions and comments. And one thing I will try to do, by the way, is to, if you get me on Twitter, T Fletcher, or if you get me on my Instagram account, which is Tom Fletcher 1874, I will try and answer any questions that we don't get to on here. Or I'll check with the communications folk and the good people at EDA whether there's a way for me to actually respond to more of your questions, because you've sent a lot of great questions here. Right, we're going to do another 5 minutes. Do I notice this is Mohammed Al-Jazmi, do I notice the role of tech companies like Google and giant private companies playing their role in filling the gaps during the pandemic? I actually think it's been, one thing that's been striking has been there's been many more of the slightly sort of smaller, medium-sized tech companies which I think have really stepped up a level. And I think there'll be extraordinary innovations that come out of this crisis. Abul Hashimi says, social media breaks are probably one of the most important coping mechanisms at the moment. Absolutely right. So I know we're slightly kind of defying that logic by doing this, but I really am finding that it's easier to deal with the situation with a bit less social media overall. I've got a load of live videos coming in. Wafa bin Kali, hello. Do I think it's time to establish virtual embassies? I'm a massive fan of virtual embassies, actually. And one of the capstones that I was supervising last year designed a fantastic virtual embassy. A plug for my book where we have a chapter on the virtual embassy. To be honest, it's probably what I was writing then 4 or 5 years ago has probably already been overtaken. And much of this crisis has been done in effectively virtual embassies. I think we will see far fewer kind of bricks and mortar embassies, and we'll get back to the original idea of the embassy, which was a group of people sent out, with an idea, basically a mission. An embassy was not a building in those days. One thing that I haven't written about, but when I was in Lebanon, I actually proposed at one point that we get rid of the building altogether because I felt the embassy itself, the building itself, was driving people away. There's a great, those of you who've read New Power by Jeremy Hyman's Henry Timms know that there's, this argument, are we a castle or a connector? And too many embassies just look like castles. They hold people out. Whereas if you're really on the front line of diplomacy, you want to be a connector. You want to be reaching out. And I felt at one point that we could do that far better out and about around town. So I will plug that. I will plug the book if you want more of that. I've heard news of countries stealing ventilators and on its way to other countries. In the EU, how would this affect the relationship with each other? It's not great. I think we have to be careful that there's probably a lot of conspiracy theory out there, and we've got to be a little bit careful as to what is fact and what is dare I say it, fake news. But there will be, and Donald Trump said this publicly, that there will be countries that prioritise a very much a national approach at the expense of other countries, and we just don't beat the virus that way. George is asking, would China go for a bigger economic and political role after the pandemic? I think that's the big question, as I say. I think the vacancy is there. There has been this vacuum in leadership since the election of Donald Trump. The Chinese so far, they've kind of edged in and then edged back again. It's going to be very, very interesting to see the extent to which they now feel that their own success as a country depends on being more involved, not just regionally, not just One Belt, One Road, but actually in rebuilding the systems for global cooperation. Right, now I have 48 seconds remaining, so I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone who stuck with us. It's been brilliant to have you all here. Thank you so much for your questions. I'm sorry that I was unable to get to so many questions. I promise you I will now sit down and do that over the days ahead. Please do stay in touch. Please do stay safe. Look after yourselves. And those of you involved in diplomacy or going out there in the future to be involved in diplomacy, we're relying on you a huge amount. You will really be on the front lines of this effort. So solidarity and good luck. Thanks everyone. See you soon. Bye.